Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us and welcome to our new webinar series. We'll be spending this year talking about demystifying systemic social and emotional learning. So if you're familiar with CASEL or social emotional learning, you're probably familiar with the wheel. If you can go to the next slide, Emily, great. And you're probably familiar with this concept of social and emotional learning as a lifelong process of developing our self-awareness, our self-management, our social awareness, our relationship skills, and our responsible decision-making. At CASEL, we also talk about SEL not just as an individual developmental process, but also as a systemic process. And this is focused around establishing equitable learning environments, coordinating practices across classrooms, schools, homes, and communities, and creating the conditions in our districts and states that allow SEL to flourish. So what does systemic SEL actually look like? So today we're going to begin to dive into 10 elements of systemic SEL, which range from what we do in classroom, types of instruction, to how we create climate that supports all students and ensures all students reach their full potential, as well as the different types of partnerships and continuous improvement processes that are really essential to high quality SEL implementation. And in the next 10 webinar sessions, we'll dive into each of these elements individually. But the truth is that if we're talking about systemic SEL, there is a lot of connection between all of these indicators. So today we're going to begin talking about one aspect of SEL that folks think of a lot when we think of SEL, which is explicit instruction on social and emotional skills. But it's actually going to have a lot of connections to other elements of SEL. So we're going to talk about the connections to academic integration, to youth voice, and even to adult SEL. So before we get into all of that, what I'd love to do, if you'll go to the next slide, I would love to invite all of you to share in the chat what comes to mind when you hear the term explicit SEL instruction. What are the associations you might have with it? What are questions that frequently pop up? Why are you joining here with us today? Great. I'm seeing some thoughts in the chat around lesson plans, around programs and curriculum, connection to specific competencies like self-awareness and direct instruction. Great, thank you. Keep sharing those thoughts. If you'll go to the next slide, Emily, I want to share the definition that we use at CASEL, which we'll dig into a little bit more. But we're really talking about when students have consistent opportunities, dedicated time, dedicated space to cultivate, practice, and reflect on social and emotional competencies in ways that are both developmentally appropriate and culturally responsive. And so what does that mean? And what does it look like in elementary school versus high school? And why is it important for SEL to include explicit instruction? That's what we're going to get into today with all of our panelists. But before we do that, I want to begin with a quick glimpse into one Ohio school. And as we're going to watch just a brief clip of a longer video, which we'll put into the chat. But as we watch this clip, would love for you to share in the chat any noticings or wonderings about explicit SEL instruction as we watch this.
Level. Each school day begins with a scheduled advisory class, part of the school's evidence-based program. It is an instructional time with the goal of integrating the love for technology, professionalism, and work ethic, with the values of respect for all people and understanding and embracing our differences.
In advisory, there's the element of mentoring though, and that's why we have all grade levels, 9 through 12 in there, so that older students can model and help mentor younger students. And then I get to loop with those students. Sometimes we'll talk about something we call peaks and valleys, which is just an emotional high and emotional low, maybe for the past week. Or other times we might ask them to check in about grades or how they feel, goal setting. And sometimes they'll share maybe a personality conflict with a teacher or something they don't understand in a class. And because they've spent a year or two with me, maybe they're willing to ask me, or I can even be like a liaison and reach out to the teacher and say, hey, this student's having a problem with this in your class, and is there any way we can figure it out?
No matter the approach to explicit SEL, one thing is clear: the relationship is a critical part of the strategy.
the more that each individual student is able to be self-aware, to be aware of their peers and socially aware, to have empathy for people who are different from them or who are having a different experience or a different perspective, all of those things enable connection, which enables learning.
When we were in the classroom earlier today, and the third grade teacher got right on the same level as those children, talking face to face. And I can tell you right now, as you go around the circle, everybody has positive things going on in their life, and some might have some negative, okay? But the key thing is when you get face to face with a child, what she was doing, she was building relationships. And when you build relationships, I always tell staff, the sky is the limit. It is the limit. You can do pretty much whatever it is you want. That's where it makes it a lot easier. It makes things more fun and joyful, especially when you're teaching in the classroom.
Thanks all as you're sharing these thoughts in the chat. Noticing a lot of threads here around SEL is not just a curriculum, but sort of woven into a lot of what they're doing, the focus on the relationships and these connections to explicit SEL instruction. And we share this example, as just one concrete look at one school that's doing it this way, but we know that explicit SEL can look different across different communities and different age groups. But there are, however, some commonalities between what effective SEL instruction looks like. So some of the foundational research on SEL has shown that to be effective, SEL instruction should include 4 elements, which are represented by the acronym SAFE that's on your screen. And the S stands for sequence, which means activities are developmental, that they build upon each other rather than being sort of random activities that we're doing day to day. It's active, meaning that students are engaged in actually practicing and applying those types of skills that they're learning. It's focused, meaning there is dedicated time and attention specifically on SEL instruction. And it's explicit, meaning that specific skills like empathy or self-awareness are named and referenced during their learning. So let's dig into all this more. I'd love to invite our panelists now to join the conversation. David Adams is the Chief Executive Officer of the Urban Assembly, where he created the National Resilient Scholars Program, which integrates SEL into curriculum and classroom practices. David also sits on the board of CASEL, and he is a Civil Affairs Officer in the Army Reserve. So welcome, David.
Thank you, Justine. It's happy to be here.
And Dr. Stephanie Jones is the Gerald S. Lesser Professor in Child Development and Education and the Director of the EASL Lab at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She serves on national advisory boards and expert consultant groups, including recently as a member of the Council of Distinguished Scientists for the National Commission on Social, Emotional, and Academic Development. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi, I'm so glad to be here with all of you.
Thank you both for coming and joining us. You both bring so much expertise and varied perspectives to this issue, so I'm excited to dig in. One of the ones I want to jump into, which is sort of both a simple and complex question that we get all the time, is what does high quality explicit instruction actually look like, especially across the different grade levels?
So are you going to tell us who gets to start?
Stephanie, why don't you start? You guys can feel free to start, but Stephanie, why don't you start on this one?
Okay. You can tell I'm enthusiastic about the topic because I can barely hold myself together. I want to talk about it so much. So I just have a bunch of thoughts about this. And as I was listening to your description, your sort of definition of explicit instruction and watching the video, it made me think a little bit more about that whole idea and how we always want to remember that explicit instruction is about a bunch of different types of things. It's about teaching, right? So it's about actual instruction and teaching things directly and surfacing what things mean in a very clear and overt way. But it's also about like experiencing, right? So it's not just about teaching it directly, but it's about experiences we have together. And that's where explicit SEL also sits. And then finally, it's also about practicing. So having opportunities to practice skills where you are either supported or you are sort of just working on these things with your peers. So it's like practicing among kids and among adults. And so I want to make sure that when we're talking about explicit instruction in SEL, we're really thinking about it in all these different facets, because that pushes us to think about how the work happens in all of the interactions and in all of the settings of a place, right? So it's not just inside the classroom where the teaching might be happening. It could be happening out in the schoolyard, or as students come into the school, or in the hallways, and so on. So that's the first thing I was thinking. The second thing that I was thinking, and is actually related to the question you just asked, is just in the way that the core ideas of SEL are the same across a developmental trajectory, and how they play out and how they look might vary across that trajectory. So what self-regulation looks like for a very young child might be different from what it looks like for an adolescent. The basic strategies of social emotional learning work is not different across the trajectory, but how it plays out might look different. So in early childhood, there's a lot of sort of integration of SEL into the everyday. There's lots of play-based work. There is direct and specific teaching. In elementary school, there's lots of lessons, there's teaching and practicing. And then in middle and high school, it happens through sort of more embedded and situated experiences where youth have more autonomy and choice, and they are more integrated into the work of the learning itself. So there's like continuity and change embedded in your question.
David, what about from your perspective too at Urban Assembly? I know you all have done a lot of this work in high schools, but also at different levels.
Yeah, thanks, Justina. So Stephanie said a lot of great things. This relationship between experiences and understanding, how we integrate some of these concepts. And from my perspective, when we think about high quality explicit instruction, we're really thinking about concept development, schema development, right? How well do students understand the idea that we are trying to communicate to them? And then how well can they generalize that idea to a situation in which they would need to apply it or deploy it in order to be successful or solve problems? And this is the relationship between the concept and the skill. And Stephanie talked about this in the elementary levels, right? We're really nailing down this concept, right? What is this idea? And then as we move to the later levels, we're giving students more opportunities to apply that concept through skill development. So for me, the perspective of highly effective systemic SEL explicit instruction is that a student has awareness, explicit awareness, conscious awareness of the social emotional skill that they are deploying in order to solve problems. So at the Urban Assembly, we do this really simply. We walk around classrooms, we close our eyes and choose a student, and then we ask them, what social emotional skill are you working on? How have you used that skill to solve problems in school, home, and the community? What are your areas of strengths? What are your areas of opportunities for growth? And then we collect that and we collate it up, and then we feed that back to our systems of support so that we have an understanding of, one, how well do students understand the concept? And then two, how well are they generalizing and applying that concept to solve problems? So those are the two tests that we use in order to understand how well the explicit instruction is being translated to student outcomes.
Oh, thanks for that example, David. What I hear from what both of you are saying is sort of this intentionality in the practice, right? Like that it may look different, but the concept behind it and the intentionality in how we're designing our lessons and how we're creating the experiences where students practice and reflect on SEL is sort of something that the adults and the teachers are really thinking very consciously about. I also want to dig into, as kids are getting getting older, one of the things that we often hear is, right, like explicit SEL, yeah, it's for younger kids, but what does it actually mean for the older kids? And wondering if you both can share, so what are some of the particular challenges with explicit SEL as you think about students getting into that adolescent, middle, high school grade level?
I actually think that sometimes the challenges come from us, meaning that we tend to treat the ways of supporting those skills, or even think about the skills in ways that are the same across development. And because of that, we don't give over to adolescents in particular kind of more hand or more agency in the work itself, which is really important for that particular developmental stage. And sometimes we risk doing something or trying to support youth in ways we would support much younger kids. And we put at risk the kind of trust we have with them, because we're not suggesting to them that we believe that they understand and that they can be part of driving the work. And so I think that that's one of the risks. I see it coming from not being necessarily developmentally intentional about how the work might look with youth compared to how it looks with much younger kids.
Yeah, if I could just riff off of some of the things that Stephanie is saying. The analogy we use at the UA is literacy, insofar as in early years we learn to read, and then in later years we read to learn. And social emotional development and skill development is a similar concept here, insofar as we are learning the skills in early years, and then we're deploying those skills in order to solve problems, right? In order to create new ways of thinking and being in these later years, right? So if we think about the instructional kind of pathway of literacy, there's a couple of things happening. And Stephanie talked about this in the developmental context. Most students learn language developmentally, right? Through interactions with their parents and their peers. It is a developmental process. You come into school and we create consciousness around that language development so that students can now deploy those concepts in ways that allow them to create, to think, to be differently in the world, because they have a conscious understanding of what's happening in a different way that they would have without the formal instruction. But then as we move into the high school years, right, we're not teaching kids ABCs anymore. We're not teaching kids phonics and sounds. We're teaching kids how to create, how to deploy, how to express themselves. And that's a similar analogy I would say in the SEL context. It's about now taking these skills and then applying them to problem-solving contexts that allow students to practice, to develop, to create, to understand their intent, to collaborate. And by naming it in the beginning and then deploying it in the later years, we enable and empower our students. And Stephanie talked about trust, right? We trust our students to deploy these skills in ways that meet their intent. And if we can keep that in our minds, we're going to increase engagement and we're going to increase the quality of social emotional development across the K-12 context.
So I can't help myself. I want to just embellish with a couple of things, because I completely agree, fully agree. And I think if we were to get really concrete about what that would look like in terms of practices, it would be in whatever it is that you're doing in your setting, it would be thinking about how to emphasize choice, autonomy, and agency, right, among youth who are engaged in the work with us, with adults, providing opportunities for like project-based activities that are tied to issues that youth care about. And that means like finding out what that is and linking it to the lived experience for them, like what is in their world and what's important to them. And then involving them in how decisions get made and in how the work is designed even. So one thing that we found in our work is that bringing youth into the design, like here's the thing that we're working on, tell me what you know about it and how it plays a role in your life. And then let's talk about how we might design something together that we could do in this community, in this school, in this program, whatever we're in together, that will help us support that in you and among your peers, let's say. I think the other thing that's really important to think about that we sometimes forget is that the social milieu for youth is really very different from the same thing for younger people. And so I think that there's something about SEL and explicit instruction in SEL that has to be deeply contextual. I'm going to throw out a technical word, groupy. Like it's about the group and about the network and about the sort of peer environment. And that's not easy all the time, but I think it's really important because it's an explicit and real thing for youth.
Yeah, I mean, I think this idea of, youth voice, youth choice, youth autonomy within explicit SEL is so important, because we often think about like explicit instruction as a one-directional thing, when in fact it's a very much a multi-directional experience that students are having. And one of the most common concerns we hear, frankly, from parents and from teachers is this sort of eye roll factor among teenagers, right? Like, oh, here comes the SEL lesson, yeah. And wondering, some of the questions that are coming up are around, like, as we talk about involving students in the design and decision making, wondering if either of you have some examples of what that actually could look like in explicit SEL instruction.
So I think that the eye roll factor is an interesting conundrum, because it suggests that youth might not think that social and emotional skills or social and emotional competencies or social and emotional stuff is important and important to them. But I think in reality that the kinds of things that we see inside that big umbrella of skills and competencies and phenomena is acutely important to them, because it's fundamentally about social interactions, about relationships, about planning, about goals, about identity. Like, it's about all these things that are really closely tied to what is valued, in particular in the adolescent developmental period. And so the eye roll factor is really about not thinking necessarily as our first step about like what's really relevant to this developmental period and how are we going to surface that and bring youth into the conversation about it, because they care about it a lot, even though we might not know that quite. So one of the things that we do in some of our work, we have a whole set of games and strategies that are tied to building self-regulation, which is really important in early childhood, but becomes important again in the transition to adolescence. Takes a slightly different form, but it's hyper salient. And in early childhood, we might be playing these self-regulation games with children. Adults are scaffolding what they're doing. And in adolescence, we talk about the particular skill and then we say, let's make a game together. Or you in this group, you design a game and teach it to the rest of us. And so it's really about, in a very practical way, bringing them into the work directly. Like they are designing the work.
Yeah, I would agree with that. There is a shift here from knowing to doing that is important, not only in the developmental context, but also in just a skill acquisition and deployment context, right? That learning about personal responsibility or decision-making, for example, is very different from making decisions and being held to account for those decisions. And some of the things that I've seen that are confusing sometimes to me is when folks, for example, have a focus on youth voice, but then those youth don't actually have to make decisions within constraints, that they don't have to take in multiple stakeholders and actually have to make choices and trade-offs. That's not actually teaching decision-making skills, right? Because decision-making is about trade-offs and multiple pathways and knowing what the problem statement is, right? Which we see in a lot of different curriculum. And so I think as we move into this notion of how do we remove the eye roll, it's about authentic opportunities to display these concepts. And that's the challenge in terms of design. When Stephanie uses this language, how are we designing schools to create opportunities for students to demonstrate these social emotional competencies? And when you do that well, and again, I've been in the military 20 years, military cares about giving 17-year-olds responsibility, right? and they do it, right? There are structures around it, but you make decisions as a 17-year-old around what you're going to do. And there's this trust thing, and I want to go back one more time to Stephanie to talk about this before. Do we trust our young people with scaffolded supports to actually demonstrate and cultivate these social and emotional skills? And when we trust them, they trust us. When we teach a class that says decision-making is important, but have no designs or organization for students to make decisions, that's not authentic. So that's the pathway. We move from unconsciously skilled to consciously skilled, and then we link that conscious skills to opportunities to deploy and practice those ideas, because these are the things that young people need to communicate, to participate in society. And I think when we know that, and young people know we know that, then the relevance is built in. We are sending you off from high school to go do your thing, right? Whether that's college, career, participate in community. And I, as an educator, am making sure that you are well equipped to do the things that we expect of you in society. And to do that, it's not about a classroom, it's not about a curriculum. It starts with those things, but it's about practices, organization, designs that help those ideas flourish for young people to show us what they got.
Opportunities for competence in developmentally supported and scaffolded ways all across all settings. It's that thing.
That thing.
And I think, and what you guys are talking about, right, is really connecting to, I think someone's putting in the chat here about what is the role of adults here and adult modeling, right? Like, what does it take for educators, for education leaders to actually create these types of spaces? So can you talk a little bit about what is the role of adults, adult modeling within Explicit SEL?
I mean, adults are central, of course, because relationships are central, and adults are part of this kind of relationship ecosystem that we're all talking about. And I mean, they play a central role because they are a role model, right? They're a model of adulthood that is where youth are going. And so they're looking for adults to live what they expect, right? And so there is this really critical, and I've seen this in the chat also, this really critical component to living and modeling the skills and the ways of being that we're hoping to support children and youth to have. And how that works across development, of course, is going to vary also. It goes from, being a model and in a way to being a collaborator, to being someone who hands over, right, some of the decision making and some of the opportunities to youth. So that version of being a model is not necessarily just inside that person who is living up to the skills that we hope to see in kids. It's about actually engaging with youth in ways that are consistent with everything that David just described. And in some ways that's handing over some of the opportunities, the competence, the decision-making to youth because you trust them. That's living it also.
And I wonder, David, maybe you can speak to this too. I think as we recognize the importance of adults in playing this role, how do we support the adults in doing this? What are the types of professional learning or the types of climate that you're actually creating at a school that allows the adults to also be able to do this work?
Yeah, it's a great question, Justina. And the answer is clarity. We are not necessarily as clear as we need to be right now in the field when we say social emotional learning, and Stephanie talked about social emotional stuff, social emotional ideas. And obviously the EASL Lab has done a lot of work to create some clarity between the different concepts and different frameworks around social emotional learning. But the first thing to do is to name. The reason we name things, and this comes from Neil Postman, is not just to create a construct of the world, but also to demonstrate what is worth naming in that world, right? Like, it's not just to understand the world, it's also to elevate the things worth understanding. So when we name something, we identify it as a thing, and we identify it as a thing worth identifying. So the first thing that we need to do is be clear with what we care about in the context of social and emotional learning. And that means if we say self-management, it needs to be very specific. It needs to be tied to teaching practices, right? What kinds of self-management practices do teachers benefit from in terms of things like classroom organization, communication skills, things like social awareness. All these things need to be really clear and delineated, not in a conceptual space, but in a practice space. And when we do that, we can then provide models for young people. And we know efficacy has two kinds of models in terms of developing it. We have coping models and mastery models, right? Coming from the notion of how young people see and develop a sense of efficacy. They watch the models, and Stephanie had mentioned this. You have the adult knows all model, but that becomes less salient over time because students become more savvy and they're able to identify the difference between the ideal state and what adults actually are, which are flawed people. But then we have these coping models that are, hey, I'm really struggling today, and I'm feeling really frustrated, naming your emotions with the way that folks are behaving. And those models tell kids that we are all developing these skills together. And as you are moving towards adulthood, the expectation is not a social and emotionally kind of perfect person, but an aware and skilled person who is able to deploy these skills. And I'll just say one more thing on this. If you look at the role of literacy one more time in our country, right, there was a time where we were graduating folks who were not really that literate, right, in different areas of the country. And then we just made a decision that part of body politic is to graduate folks who could read and learn and write at a certain level. And if we think about social emotional learning at the same time, in the same way, I want us to imagine, like, what would it be like if we could graduate social and emotionally competent young people, K to 12, at that same passion that we focused on literacy. And our country would be different, our communities would be different, and the way we interact with ourselves would be different as well.
I have two things I want to highlight from David's excellent comments. One is that we want to be really explicit, precise, and consistent in how we talk about what's important, right? So we want to be clear about what self-management means or self-regulation means or whatever it is. And that's true for the adults and in the teaching practice, like how am I going to support this thing because I know exactly what it is, but also what do we expect to see? Like what do we hope to see in young people when they are showing us self-management or self-regulation? And they need to know that too and inform it. What does self-regulation and self-management look like when I'm doing it? I need you to know that too, adult in the setting. So that's a really critical part of making this all very explicit and clear and precise. Just now shifting to the ways that adults play a role, they are models, they are sharers, right? They hand over opportunities to youth. And in doing that, it's so funny that this is coming up because I had a student ask me this question yesterday very directly, which is like, but doesn't this all mean that the adults have to be perfect, right? So we've got to get all the adults ready first because they need to be the perfect role model of all of these complex skills that we're all struggling with all the time. Like we're all working on them. And my reaction was, no, like they don't, but they have to be supported to be vulnerable and to share that it's a struggle for them too. So, when I fly off the handle with my children, I could just leave it there, or I could say, gosh, I really flew off the handle right there and that was not appropriate. And I'm sorry, here's why it happened, right? So I become vulnerable with them. And that's part of the modeling too, which is like the living of the real stuff, which is that we are all working on it all the time.
Wow, that's so powerful and important to think about as a parent also and an educator, right? I want to switch a little bit right now. We've talked a lot about developmental appropriateness and sort of the explicitness of SEL and raised the question of cultural responsiveness, which is also a big conversation that we've had around how do we make sure that the explicit SEL instruction is relevant, is appropriate, is reflective of the communities that we serve.
David, you want to go first or should I? Because we have had this very conversation yesterday. I think we had it.
Yeah, we did. Why don't you go first? I'm happy to rip off with some of your ideas.
I mean, I think that David and I think about this in similar ways, and the idea is that there are universals, right? There are foundational, fundamental human skills and competencies that we would describe as universal. And we might describe what they are in slightly different ways. Between David and I might say something like, I think that there's a universal human regulatory system, right, that is necessary to human life and function. And that is true across people and across the globe. But how it looks, how we scaffold and support it, that's true across development, but between groups of people and in different places can vary, which means that how we think about what is valued and what is prioritized has universal elements and it has specific elements. And we have to be ready to manage that, because that's core to doing the work in ways that are relevant, that are resonant, that are meaningful all over the place. There's one other thing I wanted to say about this, but I can't remember what it is right now. So I'm going to let David while I think about it.
Well, you said this really well, Stephanie, and you and I surely have had conversations about this. And I think, so one of the challenges is, the field of SEL is dominated by psychologists, and no offense to you, Stephanie, but because of that, we sometimes limit our research base to psychology to understand the concepts that we're trying to put forth into the world. But in fact, there are different traditions and different research traditions that lend different insight into these questions that we're working on, these problem sets. And to Stephanie's point, I mean, the field of anthropology has spent a long time thinking about what is universal across human culture. And it's not perfect. There have been critiques, and that's how we get better. But there are insights here, right? And it's just been interesting to me to watch how critiques from the SEL space have come into this, but the research and the knowledge from these other traditions have not been deployed to help us understand the questions, right? It's one thing to ask a question. It's another thing to do the effort, make the effort to find an answer. Maybe not the answer, but an answer. And so an answer here, as Stephanie had mentioned, is that there are certain kinds of universals and certain kinds of ways societies are organized, particularly in the social space, to solve for certain kinds of problems. And this is Jared Diamond and his book, The World According to Yesterday, where he looked at culture and he defined culture as a problem-solving apparatus, right? The role of culture is to solve societal problems. They're expressed through these traditions and these norms, but they're not random, right? They are solving for problems. And when we start to understand the kinds of problems that culture has solved for, then we can get up this ladder of abstraction and then apply that to these social and emotional principles. And Stephanie did a really good job at talking about regulatory systems, right? That's a really nice level of abstraction that allows us to both talk about self-regulation and breathing, but also talk about different ways of stoicism and different approaches and values around these ideas. But that is not to say that no society has no stance on self-regulatory outcomes for their young people or for the folks who are living in that society. So I would encourage us on this call and out in the world to take the effort, make the effort to answer these questions. There are answers. They may not be the only answers, but folks have dedicated their careers to understanding these big ideas. And as we abstract these questions to a level where we can take this literature and apply it, and then we'll move a little bit more from the psychological space to the sociological, the anthropological, and that's going to help us solve these problems in a different way than we've been doing.
Totally agree.
Great perspectives. Let's go to some of the questions that we're getting into the Q&A. There's a lot coming in here, trying to facilitate a few of these as we're going through, but I want to raise a couple here around this moment in time, right? Like we're talking about explicit SEL, I think generally, but this particular moment in time that's presented so many different challenges with the pandemic, with distance learning, with all sorts of other concerns that are coming up. What's changing around explicit SEL and COVID? Is there any anything important that we should be keeping in mind around explicit instruction, or are there ways that we should be navigating it differently?
Well, it offers a different way of talking about explicit. So we're talking about this whole webinar about how to do work in SEL that emphasizes explicit instruction. I think when we situate SEL in the context of the pandemic, we have to be explicit about how intensely and completely we need it and how clear that has become. It was clear to us and clear to many of the folks on this webinar. It's become clear to others as well during this 2-year experience. And I think my view, based on what I know from decades of research and highly effective practice, is that if we spend time here, if we spend time inside of the work of SEL, we will accelerate our bounce back in other domains. And if we don't, we will delay it. And so I think we really have to take care of people. And SEL is deeply about caring for ourselves, caring for others, working in relationships which have been challenged, certainly during these times. It couldn't be a more sort of pervasive experience of stress and anxiety for adults and children. And letting the social and emotional world sit on top is a response to that stress and anxiety, and it steps in the way of it. And so I just can't say enough how important it is to recovery to really focus here, to sit here, to do this work as we do the other work. I really feel strongly about it.
I got to double tap on what Stephanie's saying. I think, I know what we've learned from the pandemic is a couple of things, and I want to get into the gobbledygook of the SEL taxonomy here. But social emotional supports, right, which are the context in which students are developing their social emotional skills. How are we supporting students' social emotional development, social emotional wellness? What relationships, what learning contexts have we developed? Those are very, very important. Social and emotional skill development, very, very important. The social and emotional dimensions of learning, very, very important, right? And just a quick example here from my own son. During remote learning, he would come to me and I was stressed out because I had 2 kids and remote learning and I was CEO, it was a whole thing. But like he would be struggling with the word and I would come to him and we would sound it out and I'd be sound it out. And he'd be like, cat, whatever it is. And all I did was provide a presence, right? I provided a presence that allowed him to overcome that obstacle, the hurdle help. And that was one of the things that I noticed in this remote learning is the ability to just be present for students was constrained by teachers because you would talk to everybody at the same time, right? The ability to really see the struggle and then support students through that struggle. And when we talk about UA, the social and emotional dimensions of learning, right? We're talking about those kinds of interactions that help students overcome challenge and move from independence, or from work that they can do with support to work they can do independently. At the same time, the social skill development, the social emotional skill development, it's also very important. We watch students have to do things independently that they hadn't done before. And we realized that we had overinvested in social emotional supports to a certain extent, whereas students felt like they could not accomplish something on their own because they had not been asked to do so and not been comfortable struggling through tasks that were challenging. So these 3 concepts, I would say, social emotional support, social emotional development, and social emotional dimensions of learning are all, I think, really coming up for us in the pandemic. And we need to invest in all 3. But ultimately, what we want young people to be able to do is solve problems through their own social emotional competence as they move out in the world and participate in our society.
That's sort of connecting to another question that I see here around SEL professional development, which is like, in the next couple of years, what are the specific types of professional learning, professional development that we think that all adults are going to need? And one thing that I'm hearing you all say potentially is an understanding of students' development, right? Like an understanding of where they are on the developmental trajectory and these types of needs. So can you all share some thoughts off the top of your head on what do you see as critical for professional professional development over the next couple of years?
I would emphasize information about human development. So what are the key skills and how do they change over time? How does context and experience play a role? And how do we map instructional approaches and strategies and ways of being to what we know about human development? So I agree fully there. I think that there is a lot of work and support that is needed for adults. Adults are tasked with a great deal, as they should be. But it's, educating and being an educator and often a parent and an adult in our society today is tough work. And so supporting adults to think deeply about their place in this work and giving them supports to practice and learn and strategize for themselves is a really critical component to this. And I'm not saying, as I said before, that adults have to be perfect at all of it. It's adults have to be ready, right? They have to be ready. And so I think there's a place for real support for adults. And I think that demands that we think about how to embed support into places. So coaching, right? Coaching and embedded supports that happen in the place of work as opposed to in the other places where the work isn't happening, right? So our models for professional development typically rest on these like, we're going to go out of the setting of the work and we're going to learn something. And that's fine. A lot of that is great. We're doing it right now. So we need to add to that something that is about like, how can we support the use of this information, the use of this practice in the place where it's actually going to happen? And research on coaching has been very, very positive over time. It's probably one of the strategies for supportive instruction, for transforming educational practice and schools that is the most effective. So,
and that's not unlike what you all have shared about student learning, right? Like that, yes, we need to teach explicit SEL and also have the practice and application be part of that learning. David, anything you'd add there?
Look, I got to give a shout out to Stephanie. She and I don't always agree along the range of things. But when she talks about kernels, really core SEL practices that are very straightforward and simple, I feel like when we talk about adult SEL development, there's a real clear application to the kernel concept that Stephanie has developed, right? Teachers are overwhelmed, they got a lot on their plates. What they need to do is sit with the fundamentals and then work on those fundamentals effectively until they're incorporated them into their teaching and learning practice, right? So while she and I may not always agree on the student use of kernels in order to expand their problem solving, I think when it comes to adults, it's a really nice way to use these fundamental concepts, stop and think, right? Self-regulation, and then have the adults start to think about what does this mean to teaching and learning? What does this mean to discipline? What does this mean to social emotional support, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, that's what I got on that.
Great, thank you both for sharing. There's a bunch of questions. I see a real desire for sort of like, what's the practical resource? What's the practical next step? And wondering if we won't get into everything, but certainly some sort of top line ideas from each of you about what's the practical takeaway that you would share for folks here, whether they're in schools, communities around explicit SEL. What can they take and do?
That's always the $64,000 question. What was that candy bar? $100,000 bar.
100 grand, right?
100 grand. So it's it's easy to talk a lot about the ideas and the concepts, and then when you're standing in the hallway on Monday morning and something has happened, or there's an opportunity, you need something at hand. And in a sense, David mentioned the SEL kernels. One of the ideas behind that whole approach was to get folks into the work by giving them something concrete they could do right away. And so I think that from this webinar, thinking about like the next time I am in a particular situation. So what I would suggest is roll the film loop of your typical day in your head. what are the parts of my day in my situation, the setting where I am working, and what's one point in that day that I really want to work. I want to make a change in that point. And then think through a plan, like what is an SEL skill that is relevant to that particular point in the day? How would I define it? How do I make it very clear and explicit? And then what's one thing I might do to foster it and support it with the children or youth who are in that setting with me at that moment? So it's really about not getting overwhelmed, because it can be overwhelming to start this work and a little unnerving, right? Because it's very personal. It can be very emotional, no surprise. But situating it in a very specific plan tied to a moment is one way to start and then spread from there.
Yeah, I'll echo the notion of specificity. I have written here some really key points, right? The first is clarity, and we talked about this before. If you think about sports, what you do is you watch tape, right? After you've played a game and you watch tape to develop a schema, like what is the organizing principle that's happening here? And then how do we develop a player's ability to work within that schema to get to the intensity outcome, right? Or to the outcome. And so when we think about what needs to happen in SEL, particularly when we're thinking about teacher development and how they support it, is that teachers need a schema around social emotional skill development that is clear. So I call this a matrix effect, right? We watch Neo and Morpheus, it's like, it's the matrix. He's like, I don't know. He's like, it's the matrix, right? At the end, Neo finally looks around and he sees all the matrix lines and he's like, oh, this is the matrix. I can do what I want to do. And that's the SEL shift that we need, right? It's not this weird thing that you do once a day. It's like every interaction is this opportunity if you start to use the lens of the matrix ability. So we need that clarity. I want to talk about really quickly expert versus amateur ways of understanding the world, right? Experts understand it in grand designs, right? What is the organizing principles? Amateurs understand it in like each individual space. So when we talk about where our teachers need to be, they need to be able to understand it in the expert space, right? How is my classroom organized? What are the principles that are driving these interactions? And then how do I see this through an SEL lens? And then lastly, in order to do that, and Stephanie had mentioned this in terms of cognitive load, what is the difference between expert teachers and amateur teachers? Is one of the differences is their amount of cognitive load because they have practiced big ideas already, right? What are the things they do automatically as part of expertise, and what are the things that they labor to accomplish? One of the challenges we have in teaching is that we continually add in new ideas, so it's hard to develop expertise, pushes on cognitive load, lowers performance. These things, and I'm gonna go back to these kernels because I got respect for the work, right? These things that we care about need to be simple, concrete, and continually practiced. They develop the schema, they reduce the cognitive load on teachers, and then teachers are operating on principles rather than each individual state in the being. And we do that well, we'll move from amateur to experts. We'll see folks be able to reduce their stress, increase their performance, and make sure that students graduate social emotionally competent.
Thank you, David. I want to go to some of our broad key takeaways as we're wrapping up the last few minutes of this session, but would love to invite folks to also drop in your key takeaways as you're hearing David and Stephanie share these. I think, today we've talked a bit about explicit SEL instruction and really the importance of having this dedicated time, this dedicated experience for not just learning about social emotional competencies, but really applying, doing, practicing, reflecting on how these skills are connecting to their everyday lives. We also talked a lot about the importance of ensuring that these practices are high quality, are developmentally appropriate. And I just want to emphasize that states and districts, as we think about the whole system, right, play a really important role here in creating those conditions. So a lot of the states that we've worked with are helping to guide evidence-based program selection. They're ensuring the availability of high quality professional learning. They're supporting data collection to inform efficiency and impact around social emotional learning. So all of these things are part of this bigger ecosystem. And lastly, we didn't get super deep into sort of data practices and pieces here, but I really want to emphasize that when we talk about explicit SEL implementation, right, like we should really be thinking about continuous improvement and how we're measuring both the implementation and the impact on students. And by students, I mean all student groups, including students with IEPs, including students from historically marginalized communities, to make sure that our practices are both effective and equitable. And as wrapping up here, I'm going to ask the CASEL team to drop in a couple resources and links into the chat that I just want to highlight. One is CASEL's program guide, which is sort of our consumer report style guide around evidence-based SEL programs that has done some of the legwork for you and is a good way to just get started if you're looking for a good resource for next steps. And the other is our CASEL school guide, which provides sort of a way to look at explicit SEL within the whole context of a systemic approach to SEL. And with that, I want to thank you, Stephanie and David, for this really rich conversation. I feel like we could talk about this for hours and hours, but our hour is wrapping up. So just want to share our appreciation to both of you, and we'll turn it over to Emily to close us out.